The world has a specific agenda for you, and it doesn't involve your peace. Every notification, every provocation, every manufactured urgency is a bid for your attention, your energy, your emotional output. The entire machinery of modern life runs on reaction. Your clicks, your outrage, your anxiety, your need to defend yourself. Pull back from that, and the machine loses fuel. The Stoics understood this before the machine existed. They watched the same dynamics play out in courts, in battles, in the brutal social pressures of ancient Rome, and they arrived at the same conclusion regardless of the century. The only territory you ever truly own is what happens inside you, not your circumstances, not other people's behavior, not outcomes, just your interior, your interpretation, your response, your chosen direction of attention. Guard that, and you have something no one can take. These 13 principles are drawn from that tradition, not as self-help shortcuts, but as a genuine way of moving through the world, one that builds over time, compounds with practice, and produces a kind of steadiness that most people never develop because they never stop long enough to build it. 1. Don't react on cue. Somewhere in your life there is a person who knows which buttons to push. They have a mental map of exactly what makes you defensive, what sends you into explanation mode, what ignites your frustration or insecurity. And when they want something from you, your attention, your energy, the satisfaction of watching you scramble, they press. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's whether you'll be home when they knock. Reactivity is a form of accessibility. When you respond automatically to provocation, you're confirming that you're available to whoever decides to reach in and move you. You become, in a functional sense, operated by whoever knows your patterns. The dig lands, the anger rises, the defense launches, and you've just handed someone else the pen to write your next few minutes. Epictetus spent years in literal chains. He couldn't control where he was, what he was called, or how he was treated. What he could control, the only thing, was his interpretation of those conditions and his response to them. Out of that impossible situation came one of the most clarifying statements in Stoic thought: your mind participates in every provocation that succeeds. Nobody hijacks your reaction. They offer you the opportunity to react, and you accept it. That reframe is not about blame. It's about location. If someone else's behavior is the whole story, you're powerless. But if your response is always partly your own doing, then you have something to work with. You have leverage over yourself that no one else has over you. Learning to notice the moment before the reaction, the fraction of a second when you feel the pull toward automatic response, is the entire practice. That space, barely perceptible at first, grows with attention. It becomes a gap you can actually stand in, look around, and choose from. Not every conversation, not every loaded comment, not every person trying to get a rise out of you deserves the same level of engagement. Some deserve careful response, some deserve nothing at all. The distinction between suppression and genuine non-reactivity matters here. Suppression is white-knuckling your way through a moment. The reaction is still happening. It's just not visible. You're paying the full internal cost while declining to show it. That's not calm. That's performance under pressure. What the Stoics were pointing toward is something further along the path. Developing enough clarity about what provocations actually are. Someone else's need, someone else's insecurity, someone else's attempt to redistribute their discomfort, that the automatic charge simply doesn't fire the way it used to. That takes longer to develop, but it's available. It compounds with practice. Over time, something stranger and more powerful happens. People stop trying. The person who can't get a reliable reaction from you eventually recalibrates. You become less interesting as a target, because targets are only valuable when they fall. You're not performing unaffected. You genuinely become harder to destabilize. The practice creates what it practices. There is also a quieter benefit that accumulates beneath the visible one. When you stop spending energy on automatic reactions, you have more available for deliberate response. You start to think more clearly in charged moments. The information available in any difficult situation is enormous, but most of it is invisible to the person running on reactivity, because reactivity is tunnel vision. The act of pausing, even briefly, opens the field back up. There is also a quieter benefit that accumulates beneath the visible one. When you stop spending energy on automatic reactions, you have more available for deliberate response. You start to think more clearly in charged moments. You start to notice things you were missing while you were busy defending yourself. The information available in any difficult situation is enormous, But most of it is invisible to the person running on reactivity, because reactivity is tunnel vision. Stillness opens the field. 2. Let silence do the talking. Nobody teaches us to be comfortable with silence. We learn language. We learn argumentation. We learn how to fill space and assert presence through words. Silence gets treated as something to escape, an awkward gap, a passive surrender, a vacuum that the other person will rush to exploit. Turn that assumption over. In most charged situations, the person who speaks more reveals more. When anxiety is running the room, the anxious person talks. They repeat themselves. They elaborate when elaboration wasn't asked for. They add justifications to statements that didn't need any. Watch what happens when you simply don't respond immediately. The other person keeps going. They fill the quiet with whatever is actually on their mind, which is frequently more honest than what they planned to say. This is intelligence gathering in the most passive possible form. You haven't interrogated anyone. You haven't pushed. You've simply declined to fill a space, and they've filled it for you with information you wouldn't have otherwise received. But the value of silence isn't purely tactical. There's an internal dimension that matters just as much. When you're not assembling your next sentence, you can actually hear the one being spoken. You catch what's underneath the surface of what's being said. The hesitation, the contradiction, the thing being carefully avoided. Most people miss this because they're too busy thinking 3 moves ahead. Words spoken in haste are the most expensive words you'll ever use. The counterattack you launched before you understood the situation. The explanation that revealed more than was necessary. The defense that confirmed exactly what the other person was hoping to provoke. These can't be walked back. They're in the room permanently. Silence never creates this problem. You can always speak 10 minutes from now. You cannot unsay what you said 10 minutes ago. The people who mistake your quiet for weakness or concession are misreading you. Let them. Their discomfort with your stillness tells you more about them than about you. The person who needs noise to feel like they're winning says something important about how thin their actual position is. You don't have to be loud to be present. You don't have to explain yourself to be understood by anyone worth being understood by. Over time, the people around you begin to understand, without it being explained, that your words carry weight specifically because you don't scatter them. That when you do speak, it's worth paying attention to. That your silence is a considered choice rather than a failure to respond. That reputation built through consistent restraint earns a different quality of trust than anything produced through volume alone. There's a patience built into this practice that transfers beyond any single interaction. The person who has learned to sit comfortably in charged silence has developed a tolerance for discomfort, a willingness to let a moment remain unresolved until it resolves itself. That quality shows up usefully everywhere. In negotiations where the first person to speak often concedes something, in relationships where the impulse to fill every pause with reassurance can create more anxiety than the pause itself, in any situation where the instinct to respond immediately tends to produce less than the willingness to wait. Praise is a soft trap. We talk endlessly about resilience to criticism, thick skin, not personalizing feedback, separating the work from the worker. What we almost never examine is the other side, the equally powerful and considerably more pleasant vulnerability to praise. Compliments feel like gifts. They arrive warmly, and we open them without checking what's inside. But the moment approval becomes something you're quietly tracking, something you begin calibrating your behavior to maintain. It has shifted from a pleasant exchange to a controlling mechanism. You didn't decide to give up the wheel. You just enjoyed the view while someone else gradually took it. Marcus Aurelius returned to this problem throughout his private journals. Do something good in order to be seen doing it, he noted, and you've already compromised what you were doing. The action becomes contingent on the audience. Take away the audience and the motivation collapses, because the motivation was never really about the action, it was about the recognition. That's not character, that's performance. The practical distinction is between enjoying appreciation and depending on it. You can receive a compliment with genuine warmth without letting it quietly rewrite your decisions. You can feel good about being recognized without letting that recognition become the invisible hand that steers you. The test is simple. If the praise stopped tomorrow, would you continue? If the answer is uncertain, you've already drifted toward dependency. This cuts in both directions. If approval can inflate you beyond your actual position, criticism can deflate you the same way, unless you've developed something internal that neither of them can touch. That internal anchor isn't arrogance. It's self-knowledge. You know what you're doing and why. Someone else's assessment, whether generous or dismissive, is just their assessment. It doesn't alter the underlying facts. The freest version of yourself is the one who has stopped performing, who does things because they're right, not because someone is watching, who receives kindness graciously and hard feedback honestly and returns, each time, to their own compass. Nothing about that person is cold. They're just not for sale. One more thing worth noting about praise specifically: the most dangerous kind is the kind that arrives when you've done something genuinely good. It mixes real signal with potential manipulation in ways that are very hard to separate. You did something worth appreciating. Someone appreciated it. Both things are true. The question is what happens next, whether you continue from that same genuine place or whether the appreciation has quietly shifted your direction toward whatever will produce more of it. Staying honest about that distinction, even when the praise was deserved, is part of the ongoing practice. 4. Slow down. When the world speeds up, there's a particular kind of urgency that pervades modern life that has almost nothing to do with actual urgency. Things are presented as needing immediate attention because immediacy creates compliance. If you believe you have no time to think, you'll skip thinking, and skipped thinking is where most bad decisions live. The Stoics were meticulous about the distinction between what's actually happening and the framing that gets applied to it. Marcus Aurelius would strip situations of their emotional packaging and ask, what is this really? What is actually required here? Almost always the answer involved considerably less urgency than the situation was presenting. Speed feels like competence. Responding immediately feels decisive. But decisiveness without clarity is just impulsiveness moving confidently. The costs show up later. The rushed agreement you now regret. The message sent before you'd thought through what you actually meant. The decision made from the top layer of your thinking rather than the depth of it. What does deliberateness look like when pressure is high? It looks like pausing before responding, even when the pause feels uncomfortable. It looks like sleeping on things that have been declared urgent by someone else. It looks like asking yourself whether the timeline you're being handed actually belongs to the situation or to someone else's convenience. When you're moving slowly and carefully through something that everyone around you is treating as a fire drill, you start noticing things that would otherwise blur past. The inconsistency in what someone said, the option that was hiding behind the obvious first move, the assumption built into the question you were about to answer. Clarity is not a function of speed. Speed is usually its enemy. The person who can hold their pace while pressure mounts becomes one of the most valuable presences in any room. Not because slowness signals wisdom. It doesn't automatically, but because the willingness to think before acting tells people that when you eventually speak or decide, it will reflect your actual judgment rather than the anxiety of the moment. There's a kind of trust that builds around people who don't scatter at the first sign of urgency. They become the person others look to, precisely because they're not adding to the noise. There's also a longer pattern worth noting. The people who consistently rush, who treat every decision as though it requires an immediate answer, tend to spend significant portions of their lives cleaning up the residue of those rushed decisions. The email they fired off before they'd thought through the implications. The commitment they made because the pressure felt impossible to refuse. The judgment call that would have landed differently if they'd given it another day. Slowness, practiced deliberately, is not inefficiency. It's the avoidance of the particular kind of waste that haste reliably produces. Watch what people do, not what they say. Language is the most sophisticated tool humans have ever developed for managing the impressions others form of them. We can say almost anything. We can apologize convincingly for things we intend to repeat. We can describe values we've never demonstrated. We can construct a detailed and persuasive portrait of who we are that bears very little resemblance to who we actually are when no one is crafting the presentation. Behavior is harder to fake, particularly over time. What someone does repeatedly, especially when no one is watching, especially when following through costs them something. That's the actual record, not the articulate explanation for why it didn't happen, not the intention they described so sincerely, what they did when the situation made doing the right thing inconvenient. The Stoic approach to other people was essentially empirical. Observe, collect evidence, adjust your model to match what the evidence actually shows rather than what you'd prefer it to show or what you were initially told to expect. Marcus Aurelius had enormous compassion for the people around him, but his compassion was grounded in clear sight rather than willful blindness. Seeing someone accurately isn't a betrayal of them. It's the only honest basis for a real relationship. The most common way this goes wrong is the exception economy, where we process every behavioral data point that doesn't fit our preferred story of someone as an exception, a special case, a bad day, a misunderstanding, until we've built such an elaborate architecture of exceptions that the pattern they're hiding has become invisible. The pattern was never invisible, we just kept reclassifying it. There's also an inward version of this practice that Stoicism always circles back to. What is your own behavioral record? Where do your consistent choices tell a story that differs from the values you claim? That gap, honestly examined rather than defensively explained, is where the most meaningful growth happens. Not in the declaration of who you want to be, in the daily unglamorous behavior that either closes or widens the distance between who you are and who you're claiming to be. Being honest about this isn't self-punishment, it's self-knowledge, which is the only reliable foundation anything else can be built on. The person who has looked clearly at where their actions have diverged from their stated values and made adjustments is building something real. The person who manages the story of themselves instead of examining it is constructing a facade that will eventually require more and more maintenance. The Stoic practice of negative visualization isn't pessimism, it's inoculation. The difference between someone who collapses under difficulty and someone who moves through it with relative steadiness is almost never intelligence or talent or even prior experience. It's usually preparation, specifically, the mental preparation that comes from having genuinely sat with the possibility that things might not go well. Most people spend their anticipatory energy on the ideal outcome. They picture success, plan for success, allow themselves to emotionally invest in success to the point where anything short of it arrives as a shock rather than as a variation. The shock carries its own suffering, layered on top of whatever the actual difficulty is. The Stoics found this additional suffering entirely optional. Marcus Aurelius practiced this at the granular level. Before a day began, he would remind himself that he was likely to encounter ingratitude, dishonesty, and frustration. Not because he was a cynic, the meditations are anything but cynical, but because entering the day having already acknowledged these possibilities meant they didn't derail him when they appeared. They appeared as expected features of human life, not as personal failures or evidence that something had gone irretrievably wrong. Seneca made the point that the anticipation of suffering is almost always worse than the suffering itself. Our imaginations are catastrophic in ways reality rarely is. When we deliberately and calmly imagine difficulty, when we visit the worst plausible outcome, not in panic but in clear-eyed preparation, we usually discover two things. First, that the scenario is genuinely survivable. Second, that having walked through it mentally, we've neutralized most of the power it had over us as a feared unknown. This isn't dwelling. A few minutes of honest adversity contemplation before something that matters is not the same as rumination or anxiety spiraling. It's the controlled, purposeful version. You choose when to do it, you engage it on your terms, you extract the useful information, and return to your day. The fear that used to arrive unexpectedly has been diffused by your willingness to meet it on your own schedule. There's a secondary benefit that takes longer to notice. People who have genuinely practiced this, who have consistently brought honest attention to what could go wrong rather than shielding themselves from the possibility, tend to develop a different relationship with difficulty when it arrives. They're not detached from it. They feel it. But they move through it with something that looks from the outside like exceptional composure and is, from the inside, just the absence of shock. They've already been somewhere close to here. The terrain is less foreign than it would otherwise be. That quality, the capacity to remain functional when something genuinely hard is happening, is one of the rarest and most useful things a person can develop. It's not built through positive thinking or from willing yourself to believe things will work out. It's built through honest preparation, through the willingness to look at what might not work out and discover that you can hold that knowledge and still move forward. That's not pessimism, that's durability. 7. Hide your hunger. There is something seductive about announcing a goal. The moment you speak it aloud, to a friend, in a post, in a conversation, you get a preview of the feeling you're working toward. People respond. They show interest, offer encouragement, treat you as someone already partially on the way to what you're describing. It feels like forward motion. It is not forward motion. Research on this is counterintuitive but consistent. The more publicly you declare an intention, the less likely you are to follow through on it. The social acknowledgement provides a partial hit of the satisfaction you were pursuing, which reduces the internal pressure that was going to drive the actual work. You've consumed a portion of the reward before performing any of the labor, and the deficit between where you are and where you need to be has quietly narrowed in your mind without narrowing in reality. The Stoics didn't make a fetish of secrecy for its own sake. What they valued was integrity between thought, word, and action, and the recognition that premature words often corrupt action by substituting for it. Marcus Aurelius didn't write his journals for publication. He was talking to himself, holding himself accountable without the contaminating influence of an audience. The work was the point. The recognition was not. There's also a strategic dimension here. When people know what you're after, they can use that knowledge in ways that may not serve you. They can offer it and withhold it. They can preemptively judge your timeline, your method, your likelihood of success. They can consciously or unconsciously position themselves to benefit from your ambition. The person whose goals are private is moving in a frictionless environment. Nobody has calibrated their behavior to interfere with something they don't know is happening. Let the work accumulate quietly. Let the evidence build until it can't be ignored. The version of recognition that comes from undeniable results, from someone watching what you built materialize without warning, is both more meaningful and more lasting than anything that comes from an announced intention. One is witnessing something real, the other is applauding a plan. The Stoics understood this because they were fundamentally interested in what was real rather than what appeared. And what's real is the work itself, the consistency, the discipline, the private commitment that no one sees and no one praises. That's where character is actually made. The public recognition, if and when it comes, is just the confirmation of something that already existed. 8. Don't chase instant justice. The impulse toward immediate correction when someone has treated you badly is not a character flaw. It's a deeply human instinct toward equilibrium, the sense that wrong requires remedy, that the record should be set straight before the moment passes and the wrongdoer gets to carry on undisturbed. The problem is that this instinct, when followed in the heat of the moment, almost never produces equilibrium. It produces escalation. Marcus Aurelius articulated the cleanest version of this principle, refusing to become what has harmed you. When someone behaves badly toward you and you match their energy, react with the same dishonesty, the same aggression, the same bad faith. You haven't gotten justice. You've absorbed their behavior pattern. You've let them set your standard. The person who provoked you is now, in some small way, living through your actions. What the Stoic offers instead isn't passivity. It's patience, the recognition that genuine resolution almost never comes from the immediate exchange, and that the most effective responses are almost always the ones that emerge from a calmer place. The person who was trying to provoke you wanted a reaction. Declining to provide one is not surrender, it's denying them the thing they were actually after. There's also something worth examining in the urgency itself. When the pull toward immediate response is very strong, that intensity is information about you, not just about the situation. Jung pointed toward this. What irritates us in others often illuminates something in ourselves. A fear that was activated, a wound that was touched, a standard we hold that's now been violated. That's not a reason to do nothing. It's a reason to understand your own investment in the situation before acting from it. The record has a way of correcting itself over time without your direct intervention. Patterns of behavior make themselves known. Character, consistently expressed, accumulates into something undeniable. The person who treated you badly is doing the same to others, and the picture is being assembled whether you contribute to it or not. Your peace, in the meantime, is worth considerably more than the temporary satisfaction of having fired back. This doesn't mean every offense gets absorbed silently. There are situations that warrant direct response, boundaries that need to be stated, behaviors that need to be named. The Stoic isn't passive, they're selective. The question isn't whether to respond, but whether now is the moment and whether this is the response that will actually serve. Those two questions, asked genuinely rather than as delay tactics, almost always point toward a different answer than the one the activated nervous system was rushing toward. The deeper skill here is learning to distinguish between situations that need your response and situations that just feel like they need your response. That feeling, the urgency, the sense that the record must be corrected immediately, is not always reliable evidence that a response is actually required. Often, it's just the ego's discomfort with having been touched. Sit with that discomfort long enough, and you'll find you can tell the difference. What genuinely requires a response stays clear. What was just the ego's noise fades. 9. Budget your emotional energy. Consider what you spent your interior resources on yesterday. Not your time, your attention, your emotional engagement, your psychological bandwidth. The argument you replayed for 3 hours after it ended. The offhand comment that lodged itself and demanded processing all afternoon. The anxiety about something that may never happen that ran quietly in the background of everything else you were doing. Did any of that produce anything? Did the replaying change the outcome? Did the worry resolve the thing it was circling? Emotional energy is finite and real. When it's depleted, the symptoms look like mood problems, irritability, impatience, difficulty concentrating, but they're actually resource problems. You've spent something that hasn't been replenished, and unlike physical exhaustion, you often don't notice it until you arrive at something that genuinely needs your full presence and find that you've got nothing in reserve. Epictetus identified the mechanism with uncomfortable clarity. The person who can make you angry has become your authority, not a metaphor. When someone's behavior determines your interior state, when their words decide whether your day is good or bad, you've transferred something. You're no longer running your own psychology. They are, and they may have long since stopped thinking about you. The Stoic approach isn't emotional shutdown, it's conscious allocation. Some things deserve the full weight of your engagement, a conversation that actually matters, a decision with real stakes, a relationship that warrants the investment. These deserve you fully present, which requires not having already spent yourself on the provocation in your email inbox at 8 a.m. An answer. Most of the things that feel an answer. Most of the things that feel urgent in the moment. The slight that demands acknowledgement, the correction that needs making immediately, look considerably smaller from the outside of the next 24 hours. Investing your full emotional weight in them now is borrowing against a future version of yourself who will look back and wonder why. Your peace isn't a default state that exists until something disturbs it. It's a resource you actively protect by choosing where it goes. To bother you. The choice to leave and to bother you. The choice to leave an online argument unfinished because winning it would cost more than losing it. The moment you catch yourself rehearsing a conflict that hasn't happened yet and choose to return your attention to something real. Each of these is small. Together, across days and weeks, they add up to a fundamentally different quality of interior life than the person who follows every pull and pays every toll. There's also a relationship between how you manage your emotional energy and the quality of your attention to the people and things that actually deserve it. You have finite bandwidth. The person who has spent themselves on 12 unnecessary conflicts by noon doesn't have the same presence available at 3 p.m. for a conversation that matters. The version of you who arrives depleted at the things worth arriving for is not the version those things deserve. Budgeting isn't withholding, it's preservation. What changes when you actually start doing this? When you begin consciously deciding what gets your reaction instead of giving everything that asks for it, is that your baseline shifts. The minor provocations that used to derail hours start to slide past. The person who could predictably ruin your afternoon loses that particular power. Not because you've become indifferent, but because you've become selective. And in the space that opens up, you find something you'd been missing. Actual bandwidth for the things that matter. The conversations worth having. The problems worth solving. The people who deserve your full attention rather than the residue of whatever happened before they arrived. 10. Flattery isn't always friendly. The most effective manipulation rarely announces itself as manipulation. It arrives dressed as generosity, a compliment perfectly calibrated to something you've been quietly hoping someone would notice, delivered at exactly the moment your guard was already partially down. You feel recognized. You feel warmly toward whoever offered that recognition. And then, almost imperceptibly, you start adjusting. The adjustments are small at first. You're slightly more agreeable, slightly more willing to extend benefit of the doubt, slightly more open to requests that might, in a colder moment, have received more scrutiny. The compliment has done its work not by convincing you of anything, but by making you feel something, and that feeling has shifted your posture in ways you haven't consciously chosen. Marcus Aurelius kept returning to the question of what drives a given action. If the driver is a desire to be seen favorably, then the action is conditional on observation. Remove the observer and the motivation collapses. That's not integrity, that's social performance. The Stoic standard is action that would occur whether or not anyone was watching, and whose value doesn't depend on what anyone says about it afterward. What makes flattery particularly difficult to defend against is that it targets something real. The desire to be recognized, to be seen accurately, to have your efforts matter to someone. These aren't vanities. They're genuine human needs. The person who uses them instrumentally hasn't invented a fake need and exploited it. They've found a real one and leveraged it, which is why consciousness, not cynicism, is the only effective defense. Consciousness means noticing what praise does to you in the moments after you receive it. Does your thinking about the person sharpen or soften? Does your willingness to push back increase or decrease? Is there suddenly a door open that was previously closed? These shifts aren't necessarily problematic, but they become problematic the moment they're operating outside your awareness. Seen clearly, they can be evaluated. Unseen, they simply run. Receive warmth genuinely. Return to your own compass immediately. 11. Walk away without a word. The ending that gets no performance is often the most final one. When you leave loudly, with explanations, accusations, last words, ultimatums, you leave handles everywhere. Things the other person can grab, respond to, reinterpret, use to pull the conversation back into motion. The unspoken exit removes all of that. There's nothing to argue with, nothing to negotiate around, just the fact of your absence, which speaks with a precision that words rarely achieve. We're taught to believe that departure without explanation is somehow unkind or cowardly, or a sign that we couldn't handle the confrontation. What we're less often told is that this teaching mostly serves the interests of people who want continued access. The request for explanation, however sincerely it might be framed, is frequently a bid for engagement, for one more round, for the opportunity to say the thing that will make you reconsider. Providing that engagement, at the moment you've already clearly decided, is giving away something you don't have to give. Epictetus understood freedom as the specific willingness to release what you cannot hold anyway. The version of closure that requires the other person to apologize, to finally understand, to acknowledge what happened and validate your experience. That version is outside your control. It may come, it often doesn't. Tethering your release to it means handing the terms of your own healing to someone who is, at this point, the last person you should trust with it. Real resolution happens inside you, not in the final conversation. It happens when you decide, not when you've been given permission. When you've taken your own accounting of what the situation was, there will be a pull back. The impulse to send one more message, to explain one more time, to revisit the door you've already closed. That pull is real, and feeling it doesn't mean the departure was wrong. It usually means the attachment was genuine, but the fact that something was real doesn't mean it should continue. The dignity is in honoring both, what it was and the clarity that it's finished. The people who deserved your presence understood its value. The ones who didn't will feel its absence more in your quiet departure than they ever would have in your explanation. 12. Let chaos collapse on its own. There is a particular brand of exhaustion that comes from being the person who always runs toward other people's fires. It feels noble while it's happening, and it is, partly. But underneath the generosity is often something more complicated. The difficulty of watching someone else's life be messy without intervening, the need to feel useful, or the mistaken belief that your intervention will produce outcomes that the person themselves could not have reached. Every time you absorb consequences that belong to someone else, you've given them one fewer opportunity to learn from those consequences. This isn't cruel logic, it's simple cause and effect. The thing that teaches people is experience, specifically the experience of living with the results of their own choices. When those results are consistently absorbed by someone else before they can land, the learning doesn't happen. the pattern continues, the crises recur, and the person doing the absorbing wears down. Jung identified the core issue. Genuine change requires genuine contact with reality, not a softer version of reality that has been partially managed by a concerned party. The actual reality, unfiltered. When that contact is repeatedly prevented, the motivation for change, which comes from discomfort, from consequence, from the realization that something needs to shift, never fully develops. The Stoic boundary here is clean. Your mind, your choices, your responses, yours. Everything else belongs to its rightful owner, which is not you. The compassionate move is not to carry what isn't yours. It's to remain available and steady while someone else carries theirs. To be present without being a buffer. To care without removing the very friction that caring requires the other person to develop something from. Step back. Not away, but back. Let the situation develop. Let the weight land where it belongs. There is also a more self-interested dimension to this worth naming plainly. Every time you absorb someone else's chaos, you pay something. Your stability, your bandwidth, your capacity to show up well for the things that are actually yours to show up for. People who consistently take on what isn't theirs eventually find themselves depleted in a way that's difficult to trace. They haven't done anything obviously excessive, just repeatedly said yes to other people's emergencies until there's nothing left for their own priorities. You cannot give well from a perpetually empty account. Protecting your own reserves isn't coldness. It's the minimum condition for being genuinely useful to anyone. 13. Calm isn't numb. It's mastery. Here's the misunderstanding that stops most people before they start. They think the Stoic goal is to feel less, to sand down the sharp edges of emotion until life becomes a flat, even surface that nothing can disturb. That picture is wrong, and it's worth correcting clearly because pursuing the wrong version of calm leads to suppression rather than strength. The actual goal is to feel fully and respond deliberately. These two things are not in conflict. You can register grief completely and still choose how you move through it. You can feel anger entirely and still decide what that anger is worth acting on. The emotion is real and present. What changes is whether it has automatic authority over your next move or whether there's a choosing self that sits between what you feel and what you do. Think of it as the difference between being carried by a current and swimming in it. Both involve water, both involve movement. One involves no agency. The other is fully informed by the conditions without being governed by them. Marcus Aurelius was explicit that this capacity lives in the mind, not in the suppression of feeling. The mind is what evaluates, interprets, decides. Develop the mind and you develop the gap between stimulus and response, that critical space where human freedom actually operates. Neglect it, and you live entirely at the mercy of whoever or whatever happens to press you next. What does this look like in practice? It looks like someone who can sit in a hard conversation without flinching or fleeing, who can receive difficult news without immediately needing to change the subject, who can be disrespected without matching the disrespect, or praised without being altered by it. The circumstances are the same as everyone else's. The relationship to those circumstances is different. The other thing worth naming is what genuine calm makes possible that reactive living never does. When you're not spending energy managing your own triggered responses, you have more available for everything else. Your relationships become less dramatic because you're not adding to the drama. Your work improves because your attention is actually there. Your decisions improve because you're making them from a considered place rather than an agitated one. There's also the effect you have on the rooms you enter. Calm is contagious in the same way anxiety is, maybe more so, because it's rarer and therefore more striking. The person who remains visibly steady in a situation that has everyone else fraying at the edges becomes an anchor, not through any explicit action, but through the quality of their presence. Other people recalibrate around it. The temperature of a room can shift from a single person who has decided not to add to the heat. Seneca wrote that the brave person is free, not because nothing affects them, but because they've developed the relationship with difficulty. The practiced willingness to meet what's hard without requiring it to be otherwise. All 13 of these come back to the same thing. The interior life is the only ground you actually own. Protect it, develop it. Refuse to hand it over to whoever makes the most noise or creates the most urgency. The Stoics who shaped these principles didn't have easy lives. Epictetus was enslaved. Seneca was exiled and eventually executed. Marcus Aurelius governed under constant siege. They didn't arrive at equanimity through comfortable circumstances. They built it specifically because the circumstances were hostile, because there was no other option if they were going to function as whole people. What's worth sitting with is that these three men, separated by decades and wildly different circumstances, arrived at the same fundamental conclusions. That the interior life is the irreducible core of a person. That everything outside of it is, to varying degrees, negotiable. That the cultivation of the gap between what happens and how you respond is the central work of a human life. These weren't armchair philosophers reaching agreeable conclusions. They were people under genuine pressure, testing these ideas against real conditions and finding that they held. That construction is available to you. It doesn't require dramatic suffering or philosophical training or anything other than the repeated daily choice to meet your experience deliberately rather than automatically. The practice is unglamorous by design. It's mostly small choices made quietly, often imperfectly, without visible reward in the moment. The reaction not taken. The silence held a beat longer. The situation left to resolve itself. The praise accepted without altering your direction. These aren't dramatic. They don't make for compelling stories, but accumulated over months and years, they build something that most people never manage to build. A self that isn't for sale, isn't easily destabilized, and doesn't require the world to cooperate to function well within it. Keep going.